Good evening, board members. Dr. Presley. Much of the information that you'll see tonight is a carryover from last Tuesday night. The numbers have not changed in some of the slides that we want to just reiterate for you and for the public, and a new slide that was asked for that we wanted to share some information that'll provide some additional insight for you as well. So as we talked about last week, this is the public notice that was published in the Round Rock Leader on June the 8th. This is a requirement under statute to provide this information. It outlines the highest tax rates that can be adopted based on current projections. And one of the things I wanted to point out to you is if you look at the middle of the page, you'll see some increases in the average taxable value. It's about a $24,000 increase in taxable value, a little over 9%. But you'll still see, even though the debt service tax rate would be decreasing by about 2.7 cents, you still see an increase for the average taxpayer. That's because we're staying with the $1.04 on the maintenance and operations side, and so that's primarily due to value increases associated with that individual. If you look at the third box down, it says notice of rollback rate. That is the rollback rate. That is the maximum tax rate that you can adopt based on our current projections. And so that includes the $1.04 in the maintenance and operations and a little bit over 26 cents on debt service. So no changes from our discussion last week. You'll see the column in the middle in green. Everything is carried over. So we're looking at estimated revenues of $398.9 million and estimated expenditures of $413.7 million. And that represents a deficit budget of 14.8. As we talked about last week, we'll be looking this year for efficiencies and looking for ways to tighten our belts a little bit. Those conversations actually began last fall already, and so they'll continue in more earnest the next year because this is a larger deficit than it was in the current year. But it is important to note that it's still only 3.5% of our expenditures, so still a very manageable deficit. But we'll be taking a harder look at some of our different expenditures and programs over the coming months. This slide that you saw last week, and it's titled Revenues, but I want to make sure everyone is familiar with. It does include the line for Chapter 41 payments, which is actually an expenditure. But the reason why it's in here is because these three components are tied to the state funding formulas. So let's take a minute to review kind of the first two columns with numbers on the left-hand side. Our original budget from June of last year of a total of $352 million, and our updated projections, because our values actually increased about 4.4% over what we had projected in the original budget, and we had more students than what we originally projected. So you see about a $3.8 million increase from the original budget to projected. So if you carry that over and compare that to the 2017-18 budget, that comparison in the last column on the right is compared to the updated projections. So you see an increase of $29 million for tax collections and a decrease in state funding of $18 million, and also a Chapter 41 payment of almost $10 million. So that represents about 0.3% increase from these components. And remember, these are only just the state funding components. There are some other revenue sources. So when you look at some other pages, that's important to understand because from page to page, they are mutually exclusive because they include different information. This is a slide that depicts the last 11 years. So this is general operating fund. Your property tax revenue is in yellow, and you see an increase over that period of time. And the last 3 years we've had double-digit percentage taxable value growth, and so that's why you see that line going up greater. The black line represents state funding less any Chapter 41 recapture payments. So in 17-18, that includes that a reduction for the $10 million that we're projecting, or 9.7. If you went back to 07-08, back in the time that we were actually paying, you would see a reduction in that as well. And so that's kind of a net state funding. It certainly depicts what we talked about last week and how things change. So one of the questions that was brought up during the meeting and was visited with a different board member after the meeting, I wanted to show you this. And so let me kind of lay this out for you so it's understandable. So if you look in the box labeled 1.04, that's the $1.04 tax rate. These are our tax collections and state revenue, less our Chapter 41 payments for a total of $357.6 million. Same information you saw on a previous slide. If you wanted to reduce that tax rate by 1 penny to $1.03, clearly your tax collections go down, right? Our yield per penny is about 3.1 million. And so you see the tax collections go down by about a little over 3 million. You also see state revenue go down as well, from 26 to 23 million. The reason for that is Tier 2 of the state funding formulas include a guaranteed yield component for every penny of tax collection above $1, some additional funds for guaranteed yield or enrichment. And so you see a decrease, a net decrease, if you follow that column down a little bit further, of about $6 million. So not only do your tax collections go down, but your state revenue also goes down, okay? So let's move over to the next column to the right. If you were to decrease 4 pennies from $1.04 to $1, which is right about our compressed tax rate from 2006, you see a continual decline in tax collections. That would be 3.1 times about 4, so it's a little over $12.5 million in reductions for tax collections. Again, makes sense. You're reducing the tax rate, tax collections go down. Take a look at your state funding. It goes down as well, because now you're at that compressed tax rate, and you don't have any additional pennies above the compressed tax rate to generate that guaranteed yield and enrichment, okay? So your difference there is about 24 million towards the bottom, if you take a look at that. Now, if you look at 2 pennies below the compressed tax rate, you see state funding stays about the same as it is about when it's at $1. That's because you're not generating that additional guaranteed yield component. If you take a look at Chapter 41 payments across, just kind of going across the line, 9.7 all the way across until you get to something below $1. Because remember, the first 4 pennies are golden. From $1 to $1.04 are golden. They're not subject to recapture. So it makes sense that the Chapter 41 payments are staying the same. But the moment that you drop below $1, now you can generate a lower Chapter 41 payment. But it's combined with lower tax collections and a lower state revenue. So you can see there's no benefit to the taxpayer, certainly not to the district. There's a lot of benefit to the taxpayer, I should say, but no benefit to the district because of the way the funding formulas and mechanisms work. Okay? So comparing 2017-18 original budget and our original budget from this time last year, you see the differences between the two. So you look at the change in revenues of about 19.1 million. And the reason why that's different, remember, is we're taking a look at this from a original budget perspective, and we're considering other revenues. And we don't include the Chapter 41 payment at the top because it's actually included in the expenditure component at the bottom, okay? From an expenditure standpoint, if you just kind of follow along some of the major changes in that change column, you've got $3 million on line 10 for on behalf. You also see the same amount in line 8 above. So there's an equal revenue and expenditure. So it has a net effect on the financials, but if you're only looking at revenues or you're only looking at expenditures, sometimes that doesn't get seen as a wash, if you will. We've added some additional teachers for a little over $2 million. We have the costs associated with opening a new middle school and competitive salaries that you provided on May the 11th. Line 14, you see that $675,000 of an unfunded mandate that we talked about last week, where districts are required to increase their contribution. And then following down that column, you look all the way to the bottom on line 22, you see the $9.7 million in Chapter 41. So a lot of these changes, as we talked about last week, are kind of forced upon us either by the funding formulas, accounting standards, or by some legislative changes. So when you take a look at expenditures increasing $25.4 million, it's important to understand those components that we do not have control over in the district. This is our summary of budget that you'll be adopting this evening. The required, under TEA, the requirements to adopt include the general fund, special revenue, and debt service. So you see the revenues and expenditures and the difference between those. We've got a balanced budget in the food service fund. Same thing with debt service, and we'll be talking about setting those tax rates in the fall, which might change that. Capital projects, I want to make it clear that the proceeds, the revenues that come from capital projects is when we actually receive proceeds from a bond sale. So those proceeds were received in prior fiscal years. So it looks like there's a deficit budget, but we're actually spending down those expenditures. The only revenue that you see on there is interest revenue associated with maintaining those funds. Okay? Line item, or excuse me, Fund 752 for print services, that's the new fund that we're setting up. We moved out both the revenue and the expenditures out of the general fund to help save on that. We will have to amend the budget at the end of the last amendment this time next year to cover that transfer to balance that fund out. Okay? Next slide gives you the background. This is the TEA definition for the different function codes, because what you adopt under budget, it has to be segregated by function. We've always done it a little bit differently. We've expanded that to be something greater than function codes. This is your revenues. If you go down each of the different functional codes, that's where you see the breakout within the function codes of those different object codes, whether it's payroll or supplies or contracted services, those types of things. Out to the right, you'll see a change from one year to the next. This compares the proposal to the original budget. And a lot of those changes make a lot of sense from what we've talked about from the different changes. Sometimes it's a department that's moving funds from one category to the next, or within even within the function or across functions. Okay? So we won't go through the detail of that, but I wanted to point that out. There's always rationale for the reason why there might be a change. So if you have any questions, we can certainly dive into that. Under other funds, you'll see those other funds listed out here under the same, with revenues and expenditures for those different categories. And there's some additional information at the back, including your budget calendar, department allocations and campus allocations, and some tax information as well. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's any questions, and then certainly take some comment from the public if there's a desire.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you very much, Randy. I appreciate it. Can you go back to slide 12 real quick? Because I think this is it's something that needs to be just restated again and again, is how, really look at there, even at 1, the recapture payment goes up. And so then we're sending more dollars of our citizens back to the state that don't stay here to help our kids. I just found this very impactful and very helpful when it comes to educating the public and the parents and the community members about what this really means as far as their tax rate and the impact on it. And so I think that's just something I thought was very interesting and need to be highlighted again. And then
Yes, sir.
Also one thing, just to clear up, so you're saying that the tax rate's going to go down, but the impact to the homeowner could potentially go up.
Correct.
But that's just because of the rise in property values, and there's nothing we can do
Correct.
about that.
And it's because your combined rate includes both the maintenance and operation and debt side. So in the current year, it's about 78% of the tax rate is actually maintenance and operations. So even when you decrease the debt service side, that percentage on the maintenance and operation side now goes up to 80%. And that's the part that we clearly don't have a whole lot of discretion over without negatively impacting revenues. And so that's why you see, I think the pace of average taxpayer homes going up is greater than the decrease in the debt service side of things, which is so much of a smaller tax rate than the M&O.
Right.
By comparison.
Mr. Chadwell.
Yeah, I had the same question on page 12. That so there was a request to get information about reducing the tax rate if we went down to $1.03, $1.98, and how that would have an impact. That would save the taxpayers, as you said, to save the taxpayers, but it would be detrimental to the income.
Right. Well, this was a slide that we had probably two budget cycles ago that we shared with the board at one point in time. During our session last week, Mr. Tisch brought up the question, what would happen? Let's educate taxpayers on what would happen. And then I visited with Mr. Moses after the meeting as well, and he had asked for the same information. So we went back to this original slide and just recreated it based on the funding template and our current projections.
Okay.
And Mr. Stotts, can you go back to the slide that I think really summarizes it even better? I'm trying to find it. Well, not better, but just in a different way. let's see here. Where the 29,
To slide 10. I knew where
there
you were
you go,
going.
you know what I'm looking for. Again, I just think that it's very telling when we look at that slide, and actually at TASB conference on Friday last week, I was talking about this slide and showing it to people, and they were, it really does, and I happened to be with an Austin board member at the time, and they were saying it's just crazy for them as well, when you
Right.
start looking at it this way.
No, you know, in the big scheme of things, you would think that you would generate a lot more revenue when you're charging taxpayers a greater amount, or they're paying a greater amount. Now, keep in mind that we've got new value growth that's on the books, about $694 million in new value, and that represents over 1,200 new homes in Round Rock ISD this year, 17-18 versus the current year. So there's still a lot of growth out there. So it's not just existing taxpayers who are seeing an increase perhaps in their values, but it's new growth as well. But definitely, when you generate that additional amount of revenue, one would hope that you would be able to retain some of that to continue to provide high-quality educational programs to the student.
And I'm sorry, just real quick, my contacts are kind of messed up. But what is that in parentheses? I see the 1.2 million, and what's that?
It's 0.3% increase when you compare it to updated projections for 16, 17.
So year over year, about a 0.3% increase.
Just for these components.
Yes.
And these are the major components of our revenue and certainly of the state funding formulas.
Are there any other questions, board member? I do not see any other questions. Is there anyone signed up to speak? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.